One of the most interesting lawsuits in the gun industry has to be the one between Glock and Smith & Wesson. Today I'm going to tell you how that all played out, how it changed Smith & Wesson from a copycat to a top competitor, and also we're going to lead that all the way up to the SD9 2.0, which is their latest version of the gun that Glock sued them over. You may agree or disagree with my opinion on the lawsuit itself, but also I'm going to give you my opinion on this gun and why I think Smith & Wesson still makes it in the first place, and should they make it at all. We're going to cover all of that. Of course, I want to hear your opinion no matter if you agree or disagree with mine. Let me know down below. If you like what I do, consider subscribing. Let's go and get into it. Now, the first thing I want to do here is thank Smith & Wesson for sending this gun out. So not only can I tell you about the infamous lawsuit, but also give you my full opinion on the gun as well. So let's cover the lawsuit. In the 90s, really in the 80s and 90s, Glock came along and they used a number of different controversies and marketing to become the biggest polymer frame striker fire gun company in the world. They weren't the first to do it, but they were definitely the first ones to do it and capitalize on it. Now, Smith & Wesson, of course, has been around a lot longer than Glock at this point, and they make the .40 Smith & Wesson. After the Miami shootout in 1985, law enforcement needed a new round, and .40 Smith & Wesson was that round. Now, Glock at this point, in my opinion, probably being one of the more forward-thinking companies in the gun industry, was like, hey, this thing's going to take off. We want to make sure we get law enforcement contracts. So they make a gun for the .40 Smith & Wesson before Smith & Wesson. So the basis of the lawsuit, in some people's opinion, is that Smith & Wesson saw this as like, hey, that's our round, so I tell you what, you stole the round we made, we're going to steal your gun design. And they came out with the SW series or the Sigma series. Now, aesthetically, looking at the original Glocks, or the Glocks from that time, hell, even the Glocks from today, to be quite honest with you, and the SW or Sigma series, it's clear to me that Smith & Wesson took major cues from Glock all the way around. The blocky appearance, the proprietary rail, the locking block, and how it takes down. Aesthetically, it looks like a Smith & Wesson Glock, right? Not a whole lot has changed. Now the grip angle is changed and all of that kind of stuff, and different sights, but and also a different trigger, right? It was the hinge design, but either way, it's clear to me that, you know, they took some inspiration from Glock for sure. Well, in the lawsuit, and unfortunately, there's not a lot known about the lawsuit. It was all kind of done behind closed doors, so we only have bits and pieces of info to go off of. But there was something about the sear design that Glock really did not appreciate, and that's what actually won them the lawsuit in the long run. So Smith & Wesson had to make a few changes, but they were able to still sell the pistols. Now, the estimates of how much Smith & Wesson had to pay to Glock was like $5 to $8 million. I used to watch Iraq Veteran back in the day when I started my channel. I used to watch him a lot when Barry was there. And I remember Barry at one point said, you know, Smith & Wesson has to pay $9 to Glock each time they sell a Sigma pistol. I don't know how true that is, but maybe it's feasible. Maybe he knows something that we didn't. He was around a lot longer than I was, for sure. Either way, there's an undisclosed amount that Smith & Wesson has to pay to Glock. That's going to come up here a little bit later. So through the 90s, Smith & Wesson continues to make the Sigma, and then they come out with the VE series in 1999, which had some, some minor improvements. Bigger ejection port, better trigger, better grip, things like that. Well, they also came out with a ported series of this gun. This was after 1999. I did not know this at all, but they had a ported version of the SW series. By the way, of course, they had it in .40 Smith & Wesson and 9. There's 357 SIGs apparently that they made in this gun as well. Now in 2005, they came out with the M&P series. Now the M&P is significantly better in pretty much every way to the original Sigmas. And so with the launch of the M&P, I believe their sole purpose there was to obviously, kind of get their name away from the lawsuit. Sigma, it kind of always had this stigma with the Sigma, right? Because they were sued by Glock. So I believe they went back to one of the original nomenclatures that they used, M&P, military and police. They used that, way back in late 1800s, early 1900s. It's been around for a long time. Either way, they introduced that in 2005, and that pistol has gone through a series of changes too. But in 2010, with the success of the M&P, they changed to the SD series. So now you went from SWVE to SDVE. This again saw some pretty big improvements, more so to mirror the M&P series. And that brings us up to the new SD9 2.0. So they've made one very significant change I'll talk about, but some of the other things they've done is the flat face trigger. This is a change they made on the M&P. Much more consistent trigger pull than the hinge design could ever offer. So that's definitely a good thing. And a lot more aggressive slide serrations. But the MSRP went from $449 to $349. They were able to do that a couple of different ways. We now have the flat face trigger. We have a polymer rear sight. We have one 16-round magazine. And then instead of the loaded chamber indicator on the top, they actually have a viewport so you can see your brass down in the chamber. So you lose the tactile function if you're looking for that at nighttime or whatever, but you still, are able to visually inspect that without having to press check. Of course, knowing the condition of your gun is vital, right? Something everybody should know. But one thing that is cool is that all of the accessories for the SD series carry on, right? So magazines are interchangeable, holsters, all that kind of stuff. But why the heck would they still make this gun at all? Well, let me tell you, first of all, when I took this thing to the range, I was actually very, very impressed. I did not think much of this gun when I first got it. When I pulled the trigger initially, I was like, oh, it's a mushy, flat face. It almost reminded me of an original M&P with the hinge design with just a flat face, because it has that kind of mushy pull to it. You get to the wall, it breaks. Boom, right there. Reset is right there. So I'm like, geez, it's got like that false kind of reset where it pushes your finger out and you think, oh, that might be the reset. That's not the reset. It's not nearly as good. Didn't affect my shooting that much, but still, it is something I wanted to point out. The M&Ps now are much better. Now, the sights on this gun are pretty good, but now with the M&Ps, you have the ability to put an optic on everything from the shield up to the full size. If you want to go with porting, if you want to go with a 5-inch barrel, or I think it's 5.25-inch barrel, instead of the 4-inch barrel, you can absolutely do that. Better slide serrations now. These are actually pretty good, to be quite honest with you, but I like the ones on the new one. I just think all the way around, the new M&Ps are better. You have more options, and they're not that much more money, at least for some of the base versions of the 2.0. Now, I think the grip angle on this gun is pretty good. Now, I had one light primer strike early on, but after that, I had no more issues with the gun. It shot pretty well. It was reliable. After that one little hiccup, the magazines pop out of the gun. They do a pretty good job of just, kind of pooping out there. They don't shoot out of the gun, but, whatever. But one thing I noticed, you can't change the back strap on this, while you can on the new M&Ps. And your mag compatibility across the board with the new M&Ps is way better, right? Except for your shield, everything else, the capacity is better, the sizing is better. I mean, they've actually cut some weight off of this gun, but you take a shield now, the Shield Plus, and you can get up to 15 rounds in that gun, right? So it goes 10, 13, 15. If you want to go with the 30 Super Carry, well, you have that option with the Shield. This one has the polymer guide rod instead of the metal one that's used in the M&P. And while this one has some pretty nice features, you can just tell, like with the rear sight, it's a little bit cheaper, and that's the whole goal of this gun. Now, Smith & Wesson is a business, so of course they're in it to make money, right? So my guess is the lawsuit is probably still going on, so they're probably going to continue to make this gun until those terms are met, whatever those terms are, and then at some point I see them discontinuing this. Because one thing about it, even though it is cheaper and all that kind of stuff, the M&P is just so much better. I am going to assume that we're coming up on a third generation very soon with the M&P. That's just a guess. I don't have any insider information at all, but that's just a guess. So I would think at some point they will eventually drop this. So that's just my guess, why they still make the Sigma series or the SD series and why they're even coming out with new versions of the gun. But all in all, if you need to save some money, if you're on a budget and you want a good gun with a lot of M&P-like features, that so far in my hands has been very reliable and seems overall pretty well built, I think this is a great option. And in my opinion, it shoots better than a Glock because not only do I like the sights better, but also that grip angle is much better in my opinion. And even though this trigger ain't great like an M&P, it's still better than any stock Glock that I've ever shot. So Smith & Wesson might actually make a better and cheaper Glock than Glock, and they still do. This is actually a pretty impressive gun. And again, big thanks to Smith & Wesson for sending this out so I could give you a little bit of history on the gun and tell you exactly what I think about it. The M&P is a better option, but if you're on a budget and you want something with M&P-like features, I think this might be a really, really good one to go to. That's just my opinion. I want to hear yours. No matter if you agree or disagree, let me know what you think down below. If you like what I do, consider subscribing. See you in the next one. And as always, hold 'em down.